please to continue to introduce yourselves and use the chat. I am Inara Scott. I'm an associate professor at Oregon State University, and I'm also the associate dean for teaching and learning in the College of Business here. And I became very interested in ChatGPT really back in December. I had a couple of my teaching faculty reach out to me and say, like, what is this thing? I'm hearing a lot about it. I heard Google declared code red emergency. And so I got an account with ChatGPT all the way back in December, which now I feel like I'm one of the veterans, right? Because now that here we are in April, 4 months later, and you feel like it's been 10 years. So I want to encourage you all. This is an area that's moving incredibly quickly. Those of us who feel like we're a little bit more expert on this topic will quickly not become experts in like a couple of weeks when the technology changes again. So everybody in this group is on the verge of being an expert. I will say we all have the potential to learn about this technology and really start to incorporate it and think about how it's going to change our world. And so I just want to start out by encouraging everybody, if you have not yet gotten an account on OpenAI to start using ChatGPT, I would really encourage you to do so. And we're going to talk more about that throughout the sessions. So just a couple of administrative details. You're welcome to use the chat. The Google Doc is posted there too for top takeaways. Please fill that out, chat with each other. Feel free to do that. I may not keep up with the chat, but we'll save some time for questions at the end as well. And I'm also going to encourage participation as we go in the chat. So again, please feel free to chat with each other and while I'm talking as well. And I also want to just make sure that you all feel comfortable. You know, if there's something that catches your eye and you want to sort of bookmark it, or you want to push me for more details later, you're also welcome to email me, and I'll make sure I throw my email into the chat as well. But you can just always find me at inara.scott@oregonstate.edu. So the goals for this session were to think about these really big questions, and then also try to translate them into some practical tips and ideas. And so we're going to try to manage both of those things, and it's going to be really hard to do both of those things. But as we get started, one thing I'd encourage you to do is to open up a syllabus on your desktop, or if you have a Canvas course that you're either a designer for or you've been teaching in the past, have that open, and there are going to be some big questions that I'm going to ask along the way, and I'm going to encourage you to look at your course and to think about how we could apply these really very operational questions into the course that you're teaching. So the two big questions we're asking is what we should teach and how we're going to assess it. And I want to acknowledge and think about this. I actually added this slide. I initially did my slides a few months ago. I added this slide because I'm feeling the anxiety building around AI and the way that AI is going to change our lives, the way it might change our world. And so I want you to have an opportunity to do two things. Think about, if you are engaged in AI, or you've been reading about it, or you have feelings about it, throw into the chat something that maybe is keeping you awake at night. And then if you are the kind of person who is able to offer maybe words of encouragement, try giving some words of encouragement to other folks in the chat. So I want you to both post what you're nervous about, but also think about how you can support each other. I think there are going to be a lot more feelings as we go through, not just this workshop, but as we start moving into a world that has a lot of AI-assisted technology. And I think it's really important that we talk to each other about it, and that we're really open about it, and that we don't make fun of it. I think the more that you know about it, in my experience, the people who know a lot about AI are not the people who are dismissive of the changes it's going to bring. It's really the other way around. Seems to me that the more people know about it, the more they have questions, and the more that they also have concerns about making sure that we are thinking deeply about what this technology is going to do. So continue to play in the chat. offering both your what's keeping you awake fears and maybe some words of encouragement to fellow educators. So really briefly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what AI, generative AI is, how it works, and we're going to surface some of the issues that are related to that, which are what can't it do, what are some of its limitations, and how that impacts what we teach in the classrooms. So you may have heard the phrase generative AI. You may have heard about large language models. You may hear machine learning. These are all words that are important to know just a little bit about. And particularly, ChatGPT is one particular type of generative AI tool. It's not the only one. As we go forward, there's going to be more people using other competitors. And there's a whole huge field of AI applications that I want to mention. So generative AI is a tool. It is, artificial intelligence, AI, is a term that's been around a long time and that people have pushed back on in different ways. And we won't really get into some of those nuances, but the way that AI works is that it takes an existing data set of content, and that content may be art, it may be music, it may be poetry, it may be Wikipedia, it may be all sorts of text that you find on the internet. It could also be medical information. It could be data that you generate. All of those things are put into these complicated tools, and then they use that to generate something new. And so we call it generative AI. So some of what you have been, probably hearing about and seeing are not just ChatGPT, which is a text generative AI that has a chat with you, but you may also hear about DALL-E, which generates images. I'll show you a DALL-E image in I think it's the next slide. There are AI tools that can generate music. There is increasing concern about AI tools that have been trained on human voices and will be able to be narrators for audiobooks, for online resources. So that's all generative AI. And the large language model is just a particular type of machine learning. So machine learning being the way that these algorithms are trained, and it uses lots of data to produce similar text. And so in particular, a large language model just trained on many times, they sort of feed it these huge databases. So you may hear ChatGPT, there's 3.5, GPT 3.5, that's a particular data set. GPT 4.0 is a particular data set. Google has its own data set. So there are different data sets that are used, but they're enormous, right? They just have a ton of text. And the goal is for the generative AI tool to use that to produce something similar. So, this is an image that was generated by DALL-E. So some of these image generators, you can go in and you can ask it to do something really specific, like produce a graphic image that's highly realistic that shows a group of robots working on computers. Right? And you give it that kind of information, and then it will spit out an image. So that's an example of a generative AI tool. It's not ChatGPT, but it's the same type of tool. So when I think about what should we be teaching, what I think about is not how do we avoid AI, right? How do we keep it out of our classrooms or anything like that? What I'm really wondering about is how do we prepare our students for a future in which AI is integrated into their workplace? Because what we know is that it will be there. And so when we think about, I don't tend to think about, oh, I'm really nervous about, all of these jobs going away. Yes, there will be jobs that change, but I like to talk to students and suggest, my concern isn't that you're going to be competing with a robot for a job, but you're going to be competing with somebody else who is using AI. And so part of what I think we need to be thinking about is how do we teach students to integrate these things into their world, but to also keep the skills and the knowledge that they need to truly be experts in their field. So how do we truly integrate it? So I want to pause before we get into that, and I want you to throw a few things into the chat. Going to keep you all interacting. And I want you to think about, from the way I just described a large language model, and again, some of you may have a lot of experience with this already, but based on what you know of a large language model, it's trained on an existing data set of existing text, and it is taught to be predictive. So one way to think about it is that ChatGPT crowdsources answers to your question from the data set that it's been given. And of course, it has rules in place and limitations, and it has certain data, certain texts that it prioritizes over others. But can you think of some limitations that would come with that kind of large language model that is generally predictive and is based on an existing huge data set? So I'll give you a minute to throw that into the chat. What do you think some of the limitations are going to be of using these large language models? These are great. I'm going to give a full minute here. Great. Okay, so your peers are responding and have some great, before I move on, have some great ideas, and I want to talk about some of those because many of these are exactly the concerns that I think it's important to surface. So one concern, and probably one of the biggest ones, has to do with biases. Here's the funny thing. If you think about the way that AI is taught, right? It's taught with this existing data set of text and information. Well, that's kind of how we learn as well, right? Like as humans, we learn from existing resources. We learn from the people in our environment. We learn from texts. And just like all of those sources contain biases, we contain biases, and the data set contains biases. So there was an interesting I don't know if I call it a study, but someone did a little experiment, asked ChatGPT a bunch of questions that were structured in such a way that it surfaced that ChatGPT only thought of a nurse as a she and always thought of a doctor as a he. So when it interpreted questions, it assumed that the nurse was a she and the doctor was a he. This is not unlike in the early days of emojis. I think Apple has fixed this now, but if you went to your emojis and you typed CEO, you'd get a bunch of pictures of male pictures. And, if you put nurse, you'd get a bunch of female pictures, right? So those biases exist, but they exist on a larger scale even than that. There was an interesting story that I read posted. It's a person who is an expert in music and musicology, and particularly jazz, and was looking in the data set to find out information about some early female jazz artists, and there was almost nothing there. ChatGPT didn't know anything about these artists. Well, of course, right? Because it's looking at predictive text, and it knows who the most famous are. It knows, again, it's crowdsourcing. It's going to be pulling information from its data sets based on what's widely been covered. So it's going to maintain, and it's going to re-examine and resurface existing biases. So that's definitely going to be an ongoing concern with the technology. I saw a lack of human emotion. Certainly, ChatGPT is not a person, and I think it's really important. It's really easy to get lost when you are chatting with it, and you start thinking you've got a new friend, but of course it's not human, and it cannot replace our students' knowledge about how to interact with other students. It can't replace the experience of interacting with other humans. And it doesn't understand empathy. Of course, it doesn't have emotions. I saw some mention of AI hallucinations, lots of concerns with inaccuracies. this is a really key concern with this technology, absolutely, which is it.
That's fine. Just be careful driving because we have new roundabouts.
I think we need to mute somebody.
Oh, let me
Unmute.
mute. I'm sorry.
So what ChatGPT and other AI tools can do is they call it hallucinate. It's really just giving false information. It makes things up, to put it really simply. So if you or a student asked it to tell you, let's say, what are countries that have suffered from high inflation in the past 10 years? It might give you some really interesting information. And then let's say that you asked it, what's a source that I could use to corroborate that data? And it will give you a source. The problem is that the source will be completely made up. I was talking to one of our librarians at Oregon State recently, and they said they are already getting a lot of student requests for totally made up journal articles that are all coming from ChatGPT. It looks like a real citation. It's not. It's just completely made up. But students don't know that, right? Students don't know it. And those of us who are using that may not be able to tell, is this real, right? Or is this not real? It also just sort of makes things up. I asked it to build a biography of me, and it said that I went to Cornell for my undergraduate. I actually went to Duke. And then I can't remember, I think it had me going to University of Minnesota for law school. I went to law school in Oregon at Lewis and Clark. So, it just makes things up. We can't rely on it for an accurate source of information. And then I'll just talk about one other thing that I saw in the chat, and which I think is really important, which is about innovation. So some of the most important discoveries that are made are when we as humans jump from one topic, content, discipline area and apply knowledge to a different topic, content, discipline area. A friend of mine likes to tell the story of Viagra, which I think was developed. I can't even remember what the original use for it was, like strep throat or something. I don't know. But it had this side effect, and then all of a sudden, it's one of the most popular pharmaceuticals that's ever been prescribed. So we can make leaps, innovative leaps, out of context as humans. ChatGPT cannot. It is not able to unless we ask it to, right? We could ask it and say, read this poem and now tell me what application this poem might have to the development of a new drug for arthritis. I mean, we could ask it to do that, but it's a crowdsource. It's a predictive text tool. So it's going to come up with what's been come up with before. It doesn't know how to innovate and really creatively problem solve. So those are some of the key limitations of these databases. So what does that mean for what students need and what we need to be teaching students in this world where they're going to be in their jobs with AI on their desktops? And just to reiterate the importance of this, in a couple of months, those of you who haven't already, and you may already through your institutions have access, Microsoft Office is going to be debuting. Some of us have tried to put the brakes on this a little bit because there's not a lot of information about privacy and how it's going to be structured and what kind of data it's going to be collecting. But it has AI that's going to be embedded in all of the Office infrastructure. So just think about Microsoft Office, how often you use those products. It's going to be on our desktops. It's going to be right in front of us. Kids, adolescents, Snapchat has an AI integrated chat bot, right? So there is not going to be a space where we can easily say there's no AI in this space. So what does that mean about the skills students need and what the job skills of the future look like? Well, I think number one is critically assessing AI output. So one of the things that I'm going to suggest, and when we look at some of these practically tips that I'm going to suggest that people build into almost just about every single course, is to have them ask AI a question. Ooh, I think I hit the wrong thing. Sorry. Have them ask AI a question and then have them find a reliable source to back that up. And you could do this, you can imagine you could do this in any field. I can certainly do this in my field. I teach law. Imagine what this would look like in a chemistry class. Imagine what this looks like in a management class. Imagine what this looks like in a sociology class. any discipline is going to have a unique way of assessing information. And that discipline is in the best position to teach students how to critically assess the output that comes from one of these bots. Communication, empathy, relationship building, it is going to be really, really easy. And of course, we started sliding this away during COVID, and now we're sort of clawing our way back out. But it is going to be easy for us to become bubbled to like a physical. And, we talk about the bubble of the content that we see, but let's talk about how many of our students are now working totally remotely. They may not ever meet their colleagues in person. They may not even have video calls. Maybe they just have email. So we need to make sure that we are still prioritizing relationship building, empathy, communication, and the skills for working with peers. Problem solving, addressing bias, making innovative leaps. I'm going to talk a lot about magic words and context. There is a really important place still for content and teaching students what they need to know to ask a good question, or what we call prompt engineering. How do you ask the tool the right question so that you get the kind of output that you need? And then finally, team building, project leadership, all of that is going to be impossible to teach through an AI device. We have to continue to do that in our classrooms. So the challenge really, I think, and on a very practical level, is if all of this content and if so much information is readily available within the chat, how do we know what we need to keep teaching? I am convinced that we teach way too much content, that we spend far too much time getting our students. We either lecture, or we have them reading textbooks, or we have them reading articles or memorizing whatever it is. And that is information that can be found elsewhere, right? That probably much quicker than they are going to be able to do it. And probably just like multiplication tables and that sort of thing, they are going to be fully integrated in their lives in the way that they don't need to retrieve that information from their brain. They can get it from the computer. But really important caveat, some of this information is essential to asking the question. If you don't know the basic content, you can't ask the right questions, and you're going to make big mistakes. Partly because you won't know how to test the information that you're given, but also because you don't have the context to judge the type of information that you're getting, or how to get at a really creative and critical solution to a problem. So I think we need to, as instructional designers, as faculty members, as administrators, really think hard about what content we continue to teach in our courses and how we are making room for these skills, right? This is where we need to really think about flipping the script on prioritizing content over thinking, and really prioritizing thinking over content, without losing all the content. So how do we know what content stays and what goes? This to me is the challenge of an AI generative workplace and educational setting. So my first step, I would say, in this process, and if you have your syllabus open or you're looking at a Canvas course site, I think you can start right now, is to look at our learning outcomes and to ask ourselves, is this learning outcome based on work that AI can do? So I've got a couple of, these are based, again, I teach business law, and so my examples are law. I can have students identify elements of a tort. That could be a learning outcome. And frankly, that's a learning outcome that is really not particularly useful to them in a world in which that information is readily available in, 0.2 seconds, even just with a Google search, let alone with ChatGPT. What is the type of learning outcome that you can't just get from the internet, that reflects back on those student skills and the job skills of the future? Choose and defend alternative courses of action in a business scenario. That's the kind of skill-based learning outcome I would say that we should be thinking about. Now, once again, I don't want to suggest that it's not relevant what they know about what a tort is, because if they don't know what torts are, they don't know what the risks are in certain business scenarios. So this doesn't solve the problem for us. Making these kind of statements, thinking about what AI can do versus what are thinking skills, Doesn't solve the problem, but it's the first step, I think, in the process. So take a look at your learning outcomes and start there. And then the second step of that process is, okay, if I can think of what those big picture skills are that I want students to have, then I need to ask, what content-based knowledge do students need to engage in higher level thinking and analysis? So what is the type of content-based knowledge that there's simply no replacement for, that if they aren't able to maintain and have some of this in their brains, they're just not going to be able to move to that higher level of thinking. And so I've broken it down into sort of more content-based, and then a little bit, again, I'm breaking it down again into more decision-making and thinking skills. So what does that look like? So using the example of law, and I really encourage you to think about your own disciplines and what this might look like. I would say that we need to think about structure, we need to think about content, and we need to think about magic words. So let me just talk a little bit about what each one of those are. Structural basis is, how do we understand the lay of the land? So before I can really get into making a having a student analyze a business course of action based on legal risks, they really have to know how the legal system is structured. So that's a structural basis. They can't just go forward. I get a lot of students in my second year business law class. So these are second year students at Oregon State who really don't know even the basics of how the court system works. What does it mean to pass a law? What does it mean to enforce a law? Who does the enforcing? Without that information, they can't progress to higher levels of thinking. So structural issues, I think this is really key in STEM fields. There's not going to be a way to not have that structural content. We may assess it differently, we may look at it differently, but I think it's essential. Figuring out what the key content areas are and where students can learn through metaphor. So I may say, you know what, contracts is absolutely essential to my business law class, intellectual property, absolutely essential. Antitrust law, they can probably learn that by reference. If they understand the structure and they understand the way contracts work, then by reference, they're going to be able to figure out antitrust law from what they could see on the internet. There probably, I think 10 lawyers just fell over dead that I said that, but but sorry for your loss. Moving on. Magic words. And so this is one of these really important things around prompt and how we ask the right questions. Early in ChatGPT's history, so back in Chat 3.5, which was the old database, it's now been, it's still widely used. It's still the free version. There's a pay version that is Chat 4.0. I asked it a question about employment law, and what it gave me back was an answer about labor law. So it didn't really know the difference. And for those who are familiar with law, labor law has to do with unions and collective bargaining. Employment law has to do with worker, employee, employer relationships. And they're very different fields of law. The structure of the law is really different. And if I asked a question and I didn't know that there was a difference between those two things, I'm going to get back really incomplete information. Keywords in the law, reasonable person. This is an actual legal standard. I know that's always deeply troubling to people. Like, who is the reasonable person? Great question, but it's actually part of the law to ask about the reasonable person, and the reasonable person standard means something in the law. So if I put, what would the reasonable person do in X scenario, and I ask it to think about this question as a lawyer, it's going to come back with a different answer than if I ask that out of context of the law. So students need those magic words. We need to identify them. And then what problem solving tools do your students need? They may need research tools. So again, each discipline should and probably does have a different way of verifying information. So if I want students to verify, if ChatGPT told me something, I asked ChatGPT a while ago, can I fire an employee for being obese? Wanted to see what that would trigger. It came back with a totally incomplete and not accurate answer for me. ChatGPT, the 4.0 database, did a much better job with this question. It immediately went to Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a couple of states that have specific employment rules that would cover that situation. So it got much better. But I would want students, if they're going to be assessing the outcome of a chat, I would want them to find statutory language, not from ChatGPT, which probably would make it up, but from actual statutes and I would want to show them where to do that. I could show them how to read from cases and how we use the language of published cases. And then I could gear them towards particular websites that are reliable, that are places that they could find reasonable legal information. That's going to look different in data analytics. That's going to look different regardless of what kind of field you're in. The process and the way that we would teach students how to verify this information has to be discipline specific. So I noticed, I think somewhere in the chat, out of the corner of my eye, I saw digital literacy skills. Yes, absolutely. But I think we have generally proceeded with digital literacy in a sort of broad, diffuse way. I think we need to get very discipline specific because students need to know the skills of how do I verify information? If I'm doing a marketing plan, where do I find up-to-date information about companies that's actually accurate and verified, right? So I think that we need to get discipline specific in teaching students how to verify information. And then what decision-making factors? So my daughter's in nursing school right now. She was very excited and horribly traumatized by her first term in nursing school. She said, Mom, they're teaching me a totally different way of thinking. I not only had to learn about all this pharmaceutical information, about all of these drugs, but I also have to think about what's my patient's chief complaint, what are the potential risk factors, how to look at the patient. She had this whole list of how nursing students make decisions. And I make decisions differently in the law than she makes them in nursing. And I imagine that your field that you could point to, or your faculty members' field, if you're an instructional designer, this is a great question to ask them. How do people make decisions in your field? What are factors that they would consider before making a decision? Can you make that explicit for students? Because they don't walk into the classroom knowing this is how we make a decision in this field. And then, I think it's really essential that we keep hitting back on bias. And, I just highlighted a few things here that come up with bias in the law, thinking about bias in how does a business, because these create legal risks for the business, right? How are they interacting with their customers, labor and employment? And then how are internal governance structures created? You can think of myriad of legal risks that are related to internal biases in whatever ChatGPT might be spitting out. So here's an example, and then I'm going to pause for a minute and have you look at your course sites. So I tried to think about how I would take this information and apply it to a course of mine. So I mentioned I teach business law. I was an employment attorney, and so I really love teaching employment discrimination, not just because it's absolutely important information, but because it's an area that I really love. And I have a lot of stories that I love to tell. And of course, one of the hardest things as instructors is to pare back on all those stories we want to tell, because they're really fun for us to tell, but they may not be teaching our students very much. So the way I used to do my employment discrimination unit for my students, I would have up to 80 minutes of lecture, and this is for an in-person class. My online class, I would have like four or five, I think, probably different 10-minute lectures that they would watch and read. They would read all about all of these different employment statutes, Title VII, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the Equal Pay Act. Like, I go through all of it. I talk about discrimination and at-will employment, protected classes. You can see the whole list. And then I would typically do a multiple choice assessment at the end of that. Okay, so that's the old way. So what does the new way look like? So much less content. So I might just do 20 minutes, 10 minutes of lecture that was really just targeted to the most basic structural questions of how employment discrimination is typically handled by the courts. I might say there's these 5 different main statutes. They typically start with the question, what's the protected class? What does the statute seek to protect? And what might be the status of the person and how that would how that might implicate one of these statutes. And then I would just let the students loose. So have them, and I think it's really important that you structure this. So I might say, here's a hypothetical. I want you to now go and ask ChatGPT or one of the other bots. Bing is going to be becoming much more prevalent as soon as Google's not very good yet, Bard, but I'm sure it's going to get better quick. So have them, let them loose on the internet and ask them to save their prompts. So this is an essential part of this. What prompt did you give it to answer this question? And then they're going to take the prompt and any follow-ups that they have. And based on that, I'm going to have them write up their recommended course of action, turn in the AI log, and also where did they go to verify the information that they found. So whereas before I was really focused on teaching them all this content, now I'm going to give them just very little content, and then I want them to focus on the process. How would I actually answer this question in practice? I'm going to give you a couple more ideas and let you loose on your syllabus. So here are some ideas for how we can add human skills to AI tools. So again, take a look at your syllabus. It's totally fine if you're multitasking right now and looking at your syllabus or looking at a course. Could you have students ask a question to multiple different types of computer technology and AI, ChatGPT, Google, Bing, have them ask and then compare the answers. Now you have to structure this really well. So I found when I asked a question about firing an employee for being obese, I got one set of answers. When I asked, could I fire an employee because I didn't like the way they looked, I got a different set of answers. I said, could I fire an employee for being overweight? I got a different set of answers. So think about and test this and try this out. What is going to produce different answers in the different tools? Have students look at the different answers and then see what happens when they change their query. This is my big one. I think everybody should be adding to their class an opportunity for students to try ChatGPT, ask it a question, and then support the answer that it gives. And the answer might be, there's no support for this because it's totally made up. That is what it does sometimes. ChatGPT really likes to give you a bunch of, it tries to be really thorough and complete. I saw in the chat, somebody mentioned there was just, I think it was even just this morning, there was some information released. They asked ChatGPT to respond to patient questions, and then doctors looked at the way that it responded, and it was so much more thorough. Its answers were much longer than what the doctors would typically say. It also was more empathetic, and the people who were using ChatGPT were more satisfied with the answers that it gave. So it tends to be really thorough. It tries to cover the whole ground, but it also is generally somewhat reluctant to tell you what the right answer is. So it likes to tell you, here are some things that you might want to think about. Like if you asked it an ethical question, it might say, I'm an AI assisted device, so I can't tell you what is ethical in this situation, but here are some things you might want to consider. So have students go through, look at the factors it might consider response, and then have them justify the answer. Always great, have them add an ethical component to their decision. So take the computer stuff and now give it the lens of human judgment, give it the lens of human problem solving, verification, assessment, decision making. Couple other working with AI, not against it. I think it's really important that you and if you're an instructional designer, that you work with faculty work to identify what those magic words are that are going to be essential to a good prompt, because they're going to be using ChatGPT in their workplace. How are they going to ask the right questions? Have the students come up with a list of decision-making factors, have AI generate different outcomes. So I might ask ChatGPT, if I wanted to prioritize, if I wanted to prioritize a utilitarian ethical structure, so the most good to the most number of people, what would be the outcome of X hypothetical? Now ask it, what would that look like if I prioritized a different type of ethical thinking, consequentialism or something, right? So I can have it look at different outcomes based on what I prioritize. Think about embedded bias. Have your students look at an AI generated response for bias. Take AI text and rewrite it. We're finding, so Turnitin, we could all talk ad nauseum about Turnitin, has a new device that has a built-in AI checker. My faculty haven't found it to be super useful. It's brand new, but the folks I've talked to have not found it to be super useful just thus far. But there are online checkers as well, like ZeroGPT. You can put text into one of these, cut and paste it, and it'll tell you how likely it is that that was AI generated. The way that I would use this would not be to accuse a student of cheating, but to have the student put their stuff into ZeroGPT. And if it comes out more than 40% AI generated, then have them edit until they get to less than 40%. And I say this partly because it forces them to think about what their human contribution is. So if they really have used AI, it'll give them an opportunity to paraphrase, update, edit. And then for some of our students, it's actually really helpful to look at it and say, wow, I sound like a computer, right? That's not, you know, that may be how I was taught or trained, but how could I communicate in a way that sounded human? That may actually be an important skill for them to learn. Okay. So we are rapidly running out of time. I do want to talk briefly about assessment, and don't want this to be necessarily about cheating, but I am the college hearing officer for my college. I deal with hundreds of academic integrity cases. And what I have found is the number one thing that you can do on a very practical basis, this is true in the AI context and outside of it, faculty need to be very specific about what is okay and what is not okay. So if the syllabus does not have a specific instruction for what type of AI is permitted in this class, it should be added. So that's the first practical thing you can do. Add some information to your syllabus. And then for each and every assignment, and yes, I do think we need this in each and every assignment, what is permissible? What, where, and how can students use AI in their assignments? And there are a lot of things that you might say are okay. You could have them complete a first draft and then have the AI polish it. I just had a student the other day. She had been accused of cheating. She said she uses Grammarly a lot. She does her first draft on her own. She puts it through Grammarly. It comes out sounding like a computer. So save your first draft. If you get accused of cheating, you have a first draft saved that you can produce, and that can show what your original work product was. So be really specific about where it's allowed and where it's not. And then how should students indicate what they did? Some faculty are going to want students to actually give them the prompts. Some will not. Some will want, faculty will want students to do a narrative. Some will not. Do you have standard language you want them to use? I've heard of people using a slider, like on this assignment, I used, ChatGPT 100%. This one, I used it not at all. Lots of different ways that you could do this. I would encourage you to be creative in working with instructional designer and faculty to think about what kind of cool tools you could embed into an assignment that would make it really easy. If we make it too hard, students are not going to do it. So what could we do that would make it really simple and straightforward as a way for students to indicate the extent to which they used AI? And then the final question that I just want to leave us with, and then I'll open it up to your questions more generally. There's been a ton of stuff coming in on the chat, and we can look at that as well. But is that I think we need to think about online education really carefully right now, and the questions that are surfacing for me, teaching both online and face-to-face, is I think, well, in my online classes, I don't know, I can't put my arms around where and how students are doing the work. In my in-person class, of course, I can say, okay, computers away, let's do a little AI free time, right? I can have them work together. I can have them do all sorts of things. I cannot do this, right? In my online classes. So what does that look like? Is there a way for us to preserve non-AI work in the online space? And I think that's really important because, going back to those human skills that I talked about, when we start using a device, so I think about my backup camera or my GPS, right? I know I absolutely could not navigate without my GPS device. I absolutely do not like backing up my car if the backup camera's not on. What does that mean for using AI and how our brains are going to work in the future? I think we need to preserve non-AI spaces, but how do we do it in online? I think this is a really big open question. And I would love for you all to put into the chat if you have ideas about what that might look like. And then I'm going to, I don't know the best way to do this because there's so many great questions in the chat. I did see one that just said thoughts about the Turnitin AI detection. I would not, and I saw something as well about the, kind of these zero GPT. None of these AI checkers are reliable. Turnitin says that it's like 98% reliable. We don't have any specific information to verify that or not verify it. I certainly wouldn't rely on it to try to catch a student cheating. I don't think these things are nearly reliable enough. Same thing, I think there's a mention about Grammarly. It's really, really challenging to try to say, oh, this, triggered some kind of an AI checker and therefore it's plagiarism. Not to mention, not only are these not reliable, but as Lauren said, it might be an accommodation. It also might be that the faculty member just never said that it wasn't okay to use it. So students don't know what is okay and what is not okay. Let's see, how about for fun? I'm going to stop sharing. And anybody want to just raise a hand and turn on their camera and we could see your face and you could ask a question? Just put a little, bring a little human into the room. Katie, I just saw Katie, the Moodle lady.
I don't actually have a question. I was just turning on my video.
No, that's awesome though, because you have a great name and I got to say it and it made me smile. Anybody want to, Lana probably.
Yeah, Lana, yeah, good. I have a question for you. So I kind of wrote some notes, and for me, I'm a director of curriculum and instruction, and we facilitate course designing systemically, centrally, because we have mostly adjunct instructors. So would you suggest create some kind of GPT literacy course, like short course, and then for students separately, for instructors separately, and then ask instructors to kind of create those magic words and kind of, give the input? Would that be something useful if I wanna, because I need to disseminate it pretty quickly if I do something like that?
Right. I would do a couple of things. One that I would, probably recommend that we all do is, I think that it's really, really important for students to have some kind of a uniform guide for what's okay and not okay, even if it's just a default. So in my college, we created sort of a default standard, which is if you cut and pasted something out of an AI tool and you didn't give credit to the AI tool, we're going to consider that plagiarism. Now, putting aside that we don't really have any way to check that, but and so I'm not actually, I don't really have the tools to do that. But as an ethical standard, that's kind of our baseline, right? And so we can share that with all of our students. And then from there, each faculty member has some freedom in terms of what's allowed and not allowed. So I do think having kind of a baseline for students would be really helpful. We talk about it a lot in my college. I bring it up at just about every faculty meeting. I have, information that I've provided online for faculty. I love the idea of all faculty at least having basic ChatGPT or AI literacy. So I think that's a great idea. But we just have to know it's changing so quickly. It's going to be almost impossible to create like a core curriculum. It's going to be really discipline specific, and we're going to have to really rely on having some experts in the field. So I think this is going to have to be diffuse across the college or university. So creating internal experts is probably going to be helpful. Having focused meetings, maybe you encourage faculty to do focused meetings in their discipline. I think all of that will probably be helpful. And then really stressing for faculty that, and if you're able to have sort of minimum standards for your courses, the importance of including in the course some kind of AI assisted activity that brings out some of these big limitations. I think those are going to be essential going forward.
Yeah, we implemented, in our online courses where we have academic, integrity. We implemented right away. So that we did right away. So that's just a part of, operational things for us. But what I do like what you said about the expert, because it's really moving forward field. But thank you.
Thanks, Lana. Bridget?
Yeah, I was just going to add, you when you were talking about not losing the communication skills, and that sort of interacting with peers, as you were talking, it made me think about one strategy would be to have the students put in teams, and they each ask the question, and then they combine their questions together as a group and analyze it and determine what's relative and what's not. But then you would be having them communicate with each other, even online. If you put them on discussion boards and you said, this group is going to do this, ask your questions, share, compare, and write out what you think is a legitimate answer. And so I think the AI provides opportunities to put the groups together in a different way as well.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. And I want to encourage everybody in that document, please feel free to share if you have great activities and ideas that you're using or encouraging instructors to use in classes. Please add them there. I think it's just great to have more ideas and more sharing of information. Again, the stuff is changing so quickly that it can be really hard to stay on top of things. But I think that that's really essential to be done going forward. So clearly didn't get to anywhere near all of the questions that have been asked. I'll take a look at the Google Doc, after we're done here and try to get in there and answer some questions as well. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for engaging in this incredibly important topic. I really appreciate the fact that you're teaching each other in the chat. Please keep that up. That's exactly what we're going to need going forward. It's going to take a whole army to stay on top of this information. So thank you all. Please stay in touch. You're welcome to email me anytime, and I appreciate you. Bye-bye. Have a great
so
rest of your
much.
conference.
It's excellent.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.